There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Just a heads up, this interview touches briefly on the subject of suicide. If you need help, call Lifeline on 13 11 14. When you think about it, WAG is a really awful acronym. It's short for wives and girlfriends, and it refers to a group of women who have absolutely nothing in common other than the fact that their partners play sport. As far as demeaning and reductive things to call a woman, WAG is right up there with mummy blogger, diva, chick lit author, socialite. But it's worse than all of those in a way, because at least those terms describe women by what they do, not who they're sleeping with. And funnily enough, just like with all of those terms, there is no male equivalent for WAG.
Everything I've done in my life, oh, that's only because she's married to Fev, and oh, that's just because of his profile. She'd be nothing without him.
Alex Fevola bristles, if you call her a WAG, and fair enough. Because she didn't fall in love with a football player so she could be famous. But like it or not, she's come to be defined, at least in the media, for so many years, decades actually, by her AFL star husband, Brendan. And when Brendan Fevola cheated on Alex with a very famous model, and that story became very, very public, Alex became defined by that too, even though none of it was in her control. From Mamamia, you're listening to No Filter, a podcast where people tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. My name is Mia Friedman. And today, I'm sitting down in the Mamamia pod studio with Alex Fevola, who is so much more than the man she married. Alex is the founder of the successful beauty brand Runway Room. She's a photographer, she's a mum of 4 daughters, and she's a woman who has had to live some of the darkest moments of her life, some of the most traumatic times you can imagine, while the whole country watched. And sometimes, while they laughed. So how do you decide what to do after an affair? How do you hide a tragic secret from your eldest daughter for almost 20 years? And how do you forgive your husband when he gambles away everything that you have? Here's my conversation with Alex Fevola. So Alex, take me back to the day you gave birth to Mia.
So I was very young. I was 22 and I hadn't planned on having a baby so young. So it was very, very nerve-wracking and quite frightening. I was obviously really excited, but I couldn't help but, feel this sense of dread. So I was really quite frightened on the day I went in, and I went in to be induced because she was 10 days overdue. She was very content in there and did not want to come out. So I knew that I was going in on the morning to have her, and I went through an 18-and-a-half-hour labour, and I ended up having an epidural. I think it was about halfway through, and it was a difficult birth, and I ended up having to have a vacuum extraction, and that resulted in the complications that I ended up having. So, yeah, it was exciting and terrifying all at once. But ultimately, once she came out, it was magical. And I was very fortunate that I did get that overwhelming feeling of just pure love.
Where were you at in your life?
I was probably a little unstable. Well, the relationship that I was in wasn't exactly stable, but we had both made the pact to make it work. And I so desperately wanted to believe that it was going to work, because for me, I thought that this was the man that, I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and I was madly, deeply in love with him. But deep down, I knew things weren't going well.
Those first few weeks after she was born, what were they like?
They were, again, it was a roller coaster. It was a mix of, elation and baby euphoria, and also, terrible sleep deprivation, a lot of anxiety. I really suffered with anxiety those first couple of weeks. I just couldn't sleep, and it was just, I think, the responsibility, and I was so paranoid to leave her, and I was just watching her every breath, and So eventually that calmed down a little bit. But yeah, the first couple of weeks was quite difficult.
When she was 4.5 weeks old, you told her subsequently, when she was a bit older, that her father had died in an accident.
Yes.
Do you feel comfortable talking about what happened around that time?
Yeah, definitely. So I had always told her that her daddy was in heaven and that he had died. And so she knew that before she could remember anything. She always knew that information, and I wanted her to never have to have that defining moment of shock and I didn't want her to go through that. So I'd always made that very, very clear, and she knew who he was. She knew what he looked like. I just didn't disclose the complete details of how and the fact that it was suicide. I had wanted her to have a happy childhood, and I didn't want her to be marred by that. And I felt so strongly that I didn't want her childhood to suffer because of someone else's actions. I just wanted to protect her from that. So I kind of told her half the story and left the gritty details to till later on when she was an adult, or closer to being an adult.
How did you deal with it? A newborn and a partner who'd taken their life.
It's so strange because now I think about it and I think, oh my God, like it's just so much to take on at that age. But I think perhaps being in that age helped me. I think you are a lot more resilient than you realise you are when you're younger. And I think having a baby is what saved me, which is, the irony of it. Having that child was something that I felt so terrified of and, probably wouldn't have gone out of my way to plan so young, but it ended up being what saved my life because she was my purpose and, she was the reason I got up every day and continued on even, in the absolute depths of grief. So it was very, very difficult, but I think definitely being a mother is what saved me.
Was there anything that anyone said to you that was particularly helpful at that time that you can remember?
It was such a different time because there wasn't the connection that we have now with social media, and I felt quite isolated, like I was actually the only person to have ever gone through that at the time. I remember feeling very alone, which is why I did journal a lot of that time, and my mum really encouraged me to write, and she said writing is very cathartic. You need to write how you're feeling, and I'm so glad she did because so much of what happened I had completely blocked out.
Did you feel angry?
Not at the time. I think the anger came later. At the time, I just felt incredible despair and sadness, and all I wanted was him. I think that's the hardest thing when you lose a partner because they're the people you normally go to for comfort, particularly when you've got, the baby. It was just this huge gaping hole and nothing could fill it.
When Mia was 2 years old, is that when you met Brendan?
She was 3.
At what point, you've already lived quite a life. You are at this stage, 25 or so. How do you bring, most 25-year-olds are like, go to uni or I'm working or I'm, living at home or whatever. You were a single mother who'd experienced incredible tragedy and grief. At what point did you tell Brendan that after you guys met?
I told him straight away because when I met Brendan, I had Mia with me. We'd gone out for dinner with a friend.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So he, asked about her immediately and it was, are you married or where's the dad, essentially? Something like that is what he said. But so I told him, yes, straight away. I said, her father passed away and, I'm a single mum. And yeah, it was, I think, Mia was probably the reason we connected so quickly because he just adored her and she loved him. He's very, very good with children. And so, yeah, that was a big tick straight away.
Were you wary about introducing her to someone and having someone in both of your lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if I hadn't met him with her, it would have been a much longer period before introducing Mia to him. But because he'd already met her, it was, it just sort of happened straight away. So,
that wouldn't happen on the dating apps today, would it?
No, absolutely not.
What did you know about him? What did you know about football before you met?
Absolutely nothing. He was a sort of a new player. He was only 22 when I met him, so he hadn't really had the exposure yet, and I had really no idea about football. I think the only footballers I probably knew were Shane Crawford and Dermot Brereton, the ones that were on TV. And so, no, I didn't know anything about him. But the guy that I was with that night, he knew him. And so he said, oh, no, he plays at Carlton. He's a good guy, up-and-coming star. Like, I think he's going to be great. And so he'd really talked him up. But, yeah, football wasn't really a thing in my life because I just hadn't ever really gotten into it. And I think it's just because my family wasn't really into football. So it was a new world to me, but I quickly learned all about it.
What attracted you to him?
I think it was his sense of humour initially. He was very, very charismatic, very funny, just an absolute joker. When I first saw him, he had no top on, so that was kind of a little bit of it. He was just a really fun person to be around. He's the sort of person that really lights a room up. And so, yeah, that charisma is what probably attracted me to begin with.
When were the first, that attracted you to begin with. When are the first signs that so often what attracts you to someone ends up being what drives you crazy or what it becomes a real challenge in your relationship?
Yeah.
When did that shift for you? When did you first start seeing, there's a downside to this?
It was probably maybe sort of 12 months in. I started to, see that there was perhaps a bit of an issue with gambling.
What made you think that? What were the signs?
Just the way he was with money and, he never seemed to really have any. And I don't know, there was just a few things early on that I can't even really put my finger on it, but I remember thinking that perhaps he wasn't great with money. And, he'd always sort of been the life of the party. So that sort of was an instant thing, like seeing him and his outgoing personality. And that's not something that ever really changed. Like I didn't necessarily get sick of that or dislike it. I still love that about him today. But maybe the Brownlow was, where it just went a little bit too far.
What happened at the Brownlow for people who don't remember this part of Brendan's life?
He got extremely intoxicated and just, behaved in such an unruly fashion and just he made a fool of himself. And it was essentially what ended his career, really. That was probably the beginning of the end. And it was just a really sad way for someone to lose their career because it was just silly. It wasn't anything too sinister. It was just he'd had too much to drink. He was too young. It was just too much, too soon. Lots of attention, lots of, adoration from people and, being young and not being prepared for that kind of fame, money, all of it, it can go to your head. And I think it's it's really sad because I feel like really he didn't deserve what ended up happening. Was it his fault? Yes. But is it a shame? Yes. Yeah, it is a shame because he was a very talented, sportsman and he didn't get to see out his career and his full potential. So that part of it is really sad and it's a shame. But, but as he always says, he wouldn't change anything because he's now doing something he absolutely loves and he feels really grateful to have got himself back on track. So, yeah.
When did you guys get married and start having a family? How long after you met?
It was only, I think it was 2 years. So we got married in 2005. So, yeah, it was 2 years after we met. He proposed really quick. It was within the first 12 months of us being together he proposed and then we waited till the end of the following year. So it was pretty quick, pretty fast moving.
And it's only recently I've thought more about the term WAG, wives and girlfriends, and how horribly demeaning and sexist and reductive it is. Do you remember the first time you heard that term? Or the first time you realised you were one?
I think it probably would have been the newspaper in a headline. They always refer to me. They still refer to me as WAG. And I just think, good Lord, it doesn't matter what you do or who you are. that is your only validation in life is that you're married to a sportsman. And it is really sexist because it does not happen the other way around. We don't refer to Ash Barty's partner as a gag, whatever it would be. I don't know.
A dab.
You know, or bag or boyfriend.
A husbands and boyfriends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just so strange that, and the other thing is I think there's such a stereotype and people literally assume that everybody that is married to a sportsman, particularly football, is one particular kind of person. And it's just so not true. Yes, there's definitely stereotypical WAGs and I'm aware of that and I know that and that's across the world, you know, from soccer players and but what I think people in Australia don't realise is the majority of the players' partners are, you know, really incredible women from all walks of life. And it's always baffled me and I early on was quite almost insulted by it. But back then, you know, we're talking however long, 15 years ago, society just wasn't there yet. So you sort of, to even suggest that it was an insult would be frowned upon. So, I didn't really speak up then and you just sort of put up with it. And that's what we did. We put up with it. And, you know, it's not like I feel like I'm a victim, so I don't want people to misunderstand.
No,
it's
but it
not
robs
that
you
bad.
of your identity, doesn't it?
But it does, yeah. And that's, I think, it's not just the term, it's also everything you do is, you know, your husband gets the credit for it. Everything I've done in my life, that's only because she's married to Fev, and that's just because of his profile. She'd be nothing without him. And I've heard that my whole life, and I just think, you know, that's fine. And don't get me wrong, I definitely attribute a lot of my successes because of Brendan, as far as he's introduced me to people I may not have ever met. He's opened doors for me that I may never have had those opportunities. But at the same time, there's a lot of things I've done in my life that have had nothing to do with him. So, you know, it's a hard one, but it's definitely a very real stigma that's attached to being a WAG. I think people have a preconceived idea of who you are.
What did you do for work before you met Brendan?
I was a makeup artist and photographer. And I had my own business when I met him and I was doing really well. I was very, very lucky with my work. I loved what I did and I'd made a really successful business out of I did a lot of weddings, and so I'd do the makeup and the photography for weddings, and I would do, during the week, I would do like actors' headshots and model portfolios. I used to work align with agencies and they would book me to do their actors' headshots and PR shots and what have you. So, I loved what I did, and I've done that. That's what I've done my whole life. I started when I was first out of hospital after having Mia, or after the complications, and I've sort of done that ever since. Hi, I'm Alex Fevola, and you're listening to No Filter with Mia Friedman.
You mentioned before he was bad with money and you noticed that early on in your relationship. When you guys got married, did you sort of take over the management of the finances, or is that something that his manager did? No,
I did. His manager was doing it initially, and I took over. I think I took over before we were married. We were already living together and he'd moved in with me, and I was sort of looking after everything in the beginning. I was paying all the bills and I was supporting him initially. So once he'd been living with me for a while, I was like, listen, you know, you need to help me and you need to contribute and we need to do this together if you're living with me full time. And so we made that decision, and he, you know, officially moved out of his share apartment, and I took over managing the finances. But back then, you know, he still accessed everything and it was all shared. But it was later on down the track that it became something that I would do solely, just because he had identified he was not great with managing money. So that was what we agreed upon.
After the Brownlow, when he had that big night, and the reason that it was such a big deal is that he was a contributor on the Footy Show, wasn't he? And so it was all filmed, and you know, it was interesting. I was watching a clip of Brendan talking to Shane Warne when they did I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and they're in the jungle. And Shane Warne was saying his mates should have stepped in that night.
So a good bloke, has a few too many beers at a Brownlow. Made a bit of a fool of himself. Like, what's the big deal? Who'd he hurt? But I would have grabbed the senior player and said, right, we've got to look after our man.
Yep, pull him in.
I don't care if we're headlock him. I don't care if we put one on his chin. Get him out of there. Don't let him do that. Because he's too important.
I agree with that.
He's too important to the club. We need him. Let's get him out of there. Don't just let him do that.
I was watching it at the time, Warnie, and I thought exactly that.
Yeah, get him in a headlock, and even if he couldn't handle Fev, say, guys,
mate,
let's look after our mate here.
Mate, Sticks and all that were there. The whole club was there.
Yeah, well, they should have helped too. Yeah.
So no one tried to say, Fev, bad idea? Not that I remember.
Nah, they didn't.
You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. Where was everyone else?
If they had been in the cricket team and someone was doing that at the AB medal, we would have just got him out of there.
Yep.
Just got him out.
And he didn't really necessarily agree with that, you know, in that conversation with Shane Warne. But he's never tried to shirk responsibility, but it was more just that the consequences seemed to outweigh he didn't hit anyone, he didn't attack anyone, he didn't commit any crimes. He just embarrassed himself, really.
Yeah, it was just embarrassing, and no one was more embarrassed than him the next morning, let me tell you. Oh, it was just replayed over and over again, and it was just, the more you watched it, the worse it got. So, but no, he definitely doesn't try to put responsibility of it. He knows he takes full responsibility. He knows it was him. And, you know, Shane's comments to a certain extent were valid, but at the same time, you know, people did try to say, mate, you know, calm down, you know, and he was just on a mission that night. So, no, Brendan takes full responsibility, and certainly, no one else was to blame.
A lot of people experience infidelity in their relationships, but most people don't have it as a national news story. When did you start sort of wondering if there were problems within your relationship?
I think that was probably the hardest part of all of it. It was as though we were just a joke. And that's what I never understood. At the time, it was so heartbreaking to me and my family, my children, and yet everybody in the media were making jokes and just making fun of us in general. And I just thought, you know, I understood there'd been a lot of, publicity around Brendan, and that, you know, people have that argument that if you're in the public, you know, if you have a public profile, then you've got to cop everything that goes with it. But I just felt that it was so insensitive. And some of the people that did that to me and made fun of me were women with, you know, children and families. And I just thought, how can you think this is funny? But, you know, I guess people that don't know you, it seems like it's, you know, it's a distant thing. And
I can't get my head around the funny part, because, I mean, I know that he was high profile, the other person involved had a profile. You were in the public eye in terms of being married to him. What was the funny part? Like, what was the angle that people were running with that? Because it just seems like a lot of tragedy.
I think it was, again, it goes back to being a WAG, and it's, well, you're married to a footballer, what do you expect? That was the underlying message I was receiving. So there was little to no sympathy, because what did I expect? So, I mean, do I agree with it? No. But I think the other misconception is that people just constantly assumed that you couldn't possibly actually love that footballer. It was like, you're only with him because he plays football. You're with him for the money. You're with him for the lifestyle. And I just thought, okay, well, first of all, when we were first together, I was supporting him. He was a very young player, pretty much unknown. So it was none of those things. I was, you know, in a place in my life where I was ready to fall in love. I'd met this great guy who was fantastic with my daughter. And so to me, you know, I legitimately fell head over heels in love with this man. And the fact that he played football was something that didn't come into the picture until further down the track, where I started to really realise that this was a life that, I didn't realise I was signing up for. I didn't realise he was going to end up with such a big profile and that we would be, known, in Victoria more so. So, yeah, I think that's probably what it boils down to is people's idea of the relationship was probably that it wasn't authentic. I think that's why people were able to make fun of it.
And also just what low expectations to say, well, what did you expect? Like, well, you didn't expect someone to cheat on you.
No, I know. It's always baffled me, but I do think now we've progressed so much as a society, and particularly the media, I think have really evolved in recognising that perhaps, certain things are off limits and not everything's funny, So, I think we've definitely moved forward in that area.
I was shocked to read that you actually confronted this woman. You called her and you had the number. Were you just running on adrenaline?
The whole period for me, I was running on adrenaline. I'd, come out of such a terribly dark period of my life and felt as though I'd finally found happiness. And it was strange because I knew deep down, I just knew it was too good to be true. And I had this little gnawing feeling in me and I thought, this is just too good to be true. And, it ended up and it ended up going down a path that was, really very traumatic for me at the time. But again, I think that what I went through, as a young woman really set me up and held me in good stead to be able to deal with things a lot better. And every time I would feel down or sorry for myself, I was just think in my mind like, nothing's as bad as where I've come from. So as long as everybody's healthy and, I can get over this and move on. So, yeah, that's sort of how I dealt with it.
You were always very clear that you felt that responsibility lay with him because Brendan was the one that was married to you, not this other woman. Did you go to counselling? Did you make a sudden decision to leave him? How did it unfold?
So, yes, to be clear, 100% the fault lays with Brendan. He was the one who was married and in the relationship. I think what we went through at the time was really we were separated. He actually had to travel for work at the time. He'd gone to Ireland and he was unravelling himself and he wasn't handling the pressure. He wasn't handling the public profile. It was all sort of a bit too much because I think people, what we didn't realise at the time, even myself, is he was a kid from Narre Warren. He'd lived a very quiet life and he was suddenly thrust into this life of this rock star, world. And so I think it was a lot for him to deal with at the time as well. So we ended up, but because of work, being separated. He was away for quite some time. I ended up going and seeing my best friend and spending some time with her. Then we came back together and we it was a very rocky period. It wasn't like we got back together and everything was fabulous. It wasn't. We had a lot of ups and downs. We were separated again. And then we ended up getting back together properly months later. So, yeah, it certainly wasn't a quick and easy fix. We didn't do any counselling. No, we didn't. So it was just something that we worked through, and it really was something that time, was the big factor in the healing process.
You guys got back together in early 2007, and you said, "I felt foolish, judged, and ashamed, but I did it anyway." You mentioned that when you guys broke up and when he cheated, it was a source of perverse comedy for some people. Was there shame in standing by your man and being portrayed in that way?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And particularly for me, I'd always liked to see myself as a very strong feminist type woman, even back then. And I felt ashamed, and I felt like everybody just was rolling their eyes and, just thinking that I was an idiot and we were idiots, and it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. Yeah.
You must have loved him a lot to do it anyway.
I did, and I did it probably mainly for our children. We had, regardless of any of the issues we had when we were younger, he had always been an incredible dad, and, you know, I just felt like I was robbing them and I was robbing him by my, I guess, personal hang-ups, my resentment, the feelings that I felt I couldn't get over. I just felt like, it was, I guess I felt an obligation for the family unit. And, you know, in hindsight, I probably should have taken more time then, because we then, you know, went on to have a bit of a, very rocky relationship for a while. And it was that resentment, that unresolved anger that was still gnawing away at me.
I'm sure. And it sounds like you then, you blamed yourself for all of it and then blamed yourself for getting back together.
Well, I didn't blame myself.
You were hard on yourself.
Wouldn't say. Yeah, I certainly didn't blame myself for any of it happening, but I blame myself for maybe being foolish and getting back together with him. And well, it was the judgment. I definitely felt the weight of judgment from everybody. That
when
was
it was
one
actually
of the
nobody
major
else's business, and yet everyone felt that it was their business.
Yeah, pretty much. Yes. Yeah.
Did you trust? I assume one of the conditions of you getting back together was that there'd be no more infidelity. Did you trust that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think when you're faced with something that is a big fear, and for me, I was quite insecure once Brendan's, profile grew and he became really well known. I did feel quite insecure many times because there was a lot of female attention back then, and that was a fear in me. But then I think once you face your greatest fears, it's so strange because it was somewhat freeing, and I really felt completely free of that worry. It was like, well, if that's going to happen, I mean, it's see you later, and it's see you later for good. So there was no fear in me really about that sort of stuff anymore. It was very strange.
Because you'd been to that bad place, and so it was like, well, I mean, you'd been to so many bad places by now. You wrote, I just thought this was so funny the way you wrote it. You said, I felt the general perception was that we were both morons who kept doing stupid things, and so many were questioning why I would stay with him. Because after you got back together, he kept being in the media. Like, what was happening there? You said there were always dramas. What were some of those dramas?
To be perfectly honest with you, they were just tiny little incidents that the media would blow out of proportion because for some reason there was this big interest in Brendan. So he wasn't like other players. He had something else that people were just infatuated with him, and he was clickbait, and he would sell newspapers. So the littlest of things that most guys would probably, most other players were most definitely getting up to on the weekends, for some reason it would always end up being sensationalised. And so
because the narrative had already been established, hadn't it? That
exactly.
Brendan was this hard partying, cheating, sort of screw up of a guy, and what's he going to do next? And the more stories that fed into that narrative, the more clicks and newspapers they could monetize.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. The narrative had already been set, and there was a very much a preconceived idea of who we were as people. And the frustrating thing was there was no redress for us back then. This was, just before social media really took off. And so you didn't have a voice, and you couldn't defend yourself, and you couldn't say, well, that's not true. Yeah. That's been taken out of context. There was nothing. So it was very frustrating. But, as I've always said, if Brendan, wasn't the incredible, amazing father and human that he is, would I have, stayed with him? And I think
you would have bounced.
Yeah, there is a lot. Yeah, there's a lot more to Brendan than the media has portrayed. That's for sure.
You guys moved up to Queensland. He had to get whatever job he could take in footy at this stage. When did you realise that the gambling was a real issue?
So just to clarify, he was still in hot demand. So he had a lot of offers on the table. Although Carlton had said, look, we're going to have to trade you because, there was a lot of pressure. There was media and public pressure. forcing their hand and saying,
because
you're going
he'd
to have to cut
been
ties
drunk
with
at the
him.
Brownlows, so they had to set an
Yes.
example by cutting him loose.
Yep, there'd been a
Okay.
couple of little incidents, and there was just this pressure that he was this loose cannon, and they needed to make a stand. So he had a lot of offers on the table. There was a lot of clubs that were very interested, and Brisbane was the one we decided to go with purely because they were offering a great deal, and we felt that it was really going to be good for us as a family to get out of Melbourne.
Yeah, fresh start.
And it's just a lot less, attention and whatever in Queensland, because AFL is it's not like it is in Victoria. So that's why we decided to go to Brisbane, and it seems like such a lovely fresh start too, like where we'd sort of gone and met with them, and we'd looked at the areas where we would be living, and it just all seemed really like, yep, this is the right move. And so we moved up there. He started his new job with the Brisbane Lions, and in the beginning it was all going really well.
Do footballers get paid a ton?
They certainly get paid very well for what they do, that's for sure. Yeah, they get paid very well.
And did he have access to all that money?
He did in the beginning, and then, not towards the end, and not when we moved to Queensland. That was at that time we'd established that there was definitely an issue with the gambling, and I was like looking after our finances at that point.
How would he get the money to gamble?
So by that stage, he was getting credit from bookies. So that's what was going on. Because people, I think, don't understand, well, if you had control, how did he blow it all? It was because, bookies would extend lines of credit, and then once you owed it, you had to pay it. So, and I could not stop them doing that. That was something that was completely out of my control. So again, there's been a lot of evolution in that industry, and now I don't think they can do that now. It's a lot stricter and a lot more rules and regulations around that kind of thing to stop people getting themselves into too much trouble. But back then,
Brendan acknowledge that he had a gambling problem, or did he still, like a lot of addicts, think that he could control it?
At the time, there was times when he would justify it and think he could control it, but overall, yes, he acknowledged that he had an issue with it. Yeah.
And what was his gambling of choice? Anything?
Horses, mainly horses, dogs. The racing gambling. Yeah.
What was the lowest point in his gambling for you as a family?
Well, it would be when we found out that he'd actually gambled an entire year's wages away. So, I was the pay hadn't gone into the account, and I thought, that's so strange. What's going on? And I couldn't get on to anybody. No one was answering my calls. I was trying to find out what had happened with the pays, and eventually I received, or someone answered my call and told me that there was no pay, and it was the entire year's worth of pay. And so at that time I just had a baby, I wasn't working, and it was very daunting. It was not good news. Not a good news day that day.
What did you do after you got off the phone?
I was actually just in disbelief. I could not believe that this would all happen and no one would notify me. That was the main, I think the biggest shock of it all was that this had all gone on behind the scenes, and nobody thought it was important to tell me that that's what was happening. And yes, it was just, I had to go into, recovery mode. I was like, okay, we had to get out of where we were living. We just bought a house. We had to sell everything, and I moved back to Melbourne, and I moved in with my mum with my 3 kids, and Brendan moved in with a teammate, and that was it. We just had to start rebuilding again.
Had the people around him been aware of the fact that he was a gambling addict?
I can't speak for everybody, but I know that there was people that had been notified. Yes, I had been very clear when we first moved up there to the people that needed to know that there was an issue, and Brendan made them aware as well. And we'd had the understanding that if anything was untoward was happening financially, that I needed to be told. And that didn't happen until it was too late.
It sounds like it would be something really challenging to navigate, that idea of being someone's partner but also being their mother / policeman.
Yeah, it was definitely.
Yeah, was that challenging?
Yeah, I think it is hard in a relationship if you're the one laying the rules down and you're
the
policing
killjoy.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is how I felt. And I felt like I was always nagging and I was always complaining. And it definitely made it difficult. And I think being young, like being a young couple and having, that role, it is a killjoy. Like, it's not the greatest dynamic for a relationship. So I think that definitely would have affected us as a couple. So, yeah.
What help did he get for his gambling?
He got a lot of help. He ended up going into rehab, which was predominantly for the gambling and anxiety and just general, well, more so depression, I think they classified it as at the time. And, I mean, I don't know what the actual therapy really did for him, but I know that the events that unfolded is what got him back on track. So the losing his job and hitting rock bottom definitely is why he is the person he is today. It's like he had to lose it all to really appreciate what he had in the first place. And he's one of the most grateful, happiest humans you'll ever see. And I think a lot of it's got to do with, the fact that he really does know and understand how lucky he is now to have the job he's got, to have the family he's got, and to have the life he's got.
Where did the motivation and inspiration come to start your own business? Was it a matter of survival because you knew you had to support your girls?
Yeah, it was definitely it was both passion. I was incredibly passionate about what I did. I loved the idea of the transformation for women. I loved getting a client in my chair and transforming them and seeing the happiness and the confidence. And, I'd always loved that. And I'd always had that idea and that dream that I wanted to do it as a service, an everyday service where, instead of just doing it for a bride or for a model for a portfolio shoot, I wanted the everyday woman to be able to come in and experience that, that what models experience before they walk out onto a runway, the professionals making the absolute very best of you. And I'd always had that dream to make it a service available to everybody all the time. And when I'd sort of done Dancing with the Stars and I had this window where I thought it's either now or never. I'm going to continue being a one-man show and just continue doing the photography and what have you, and the weddings, which had got really hard having 3 kids.
And you can't scale it up, can you, when it's just you? When you're a one-woman band, there's only many weekends and so many hours in your day.
That's right. And a lot of my work was weekends. So it was very hard with 3 young kids to keep shooting weddings every weekend because I would be gone from 8 a.m. till 9, 10 o'clock at night. So, I thought, okay, and this dream, I'd had this dream for a long time. And so that was the moment where I thought, right, I'm just going to do it. And I opened my first store in Hampton in Victoria. And it was so funny because where I opened, it was just the most dead part of the street. There was no foot traffic. And people just thought I was insane. They're like, oh, my God, this – and it was a new concept. No one had done what I'd done. There'd been hairdressers that would have a makeup artist come in on a weekend sometimes, but it was very inconsistent. And
can you explain what the concept was?
So it was hairstyling and makeup artistry. It was all things beauty, actually. We did spray tans, we did lash extensions and brows, but the main service that we became known for was – the Luxe Makeover, which was an event-ready package. So you've got a black tie event or you've got a wedding, something special. You come in, we'll style your hair, we'll do your makeup, and you'll leave looking and feeling incredible. And I wanted to make it affordable, accessible at all times. So whether it was a Tuesday or whether it was a Saturday, you would be able to get that same
it's a genius business idea, absolutely genius.
Thank you. Well, it really was a big gaping hole in the market,
Yeah.
it seemed, because it literally took off straight away, and it was word of mouth, and that is something that, you know, I'm so grateful for, to all my beautiful clients that just raved about us, raved about our staff and our services. And I think the other thing was it's a visual thing, so it would speak for itself, and, you know, women would see each other and be like, wow, you know, you look amazing, and like, oh yeah, it's this new place. And so it just took off purely by word of mouth. And, you know, even now that we're more in the product space, it's still thanks to our amazing clients and that beautiful community that we've created is why we're still growing, because, yeah, we're so lucky to have such supportive customers. And
How many salons do you have?
so I did have 5, but right now we've only got 1. We closed to Hampton and Paran were going to be merging, and we were going to relocate to Brighton just before COVID hit. And I ended up
such a tough time for you, for that business, I imagine.
Well, it was, but it was so lucky, really, because the lease was up where I was and we were moving anyway. So right at the start of it, I'd already closed down and we were going to reopen. And I was one of the lucky ones, really, because I had the opportunity just to sit and not be paying rent with that particular store anyway. And in that period, we had such an incredible growth spurt with our product line, and the products is what I've, you know, been very, very passionate about, something that I'd always hoped was the big picture. And yeah, during COVID, we were so lucky. It just took off, and so we just decided that really once it sort of we're still now, you know, still facing these, you know, outbreaks. So I've just, whether I reopen, I don't know. Whether I reopen that store, I'm not sure. But one thing I am sure about is the growth of the brand in general, and the products have just been, it's been incredible. And yeah, I'm really, really grateful again to our little beauty community.
That was such an interesting conversation, and I also had the experience of splitting with my partner and getting back together with him. Something Alex did that I didn't do, which I really wished that I had, is to have a 4th child, kind of after you'd finished doing the bulk of your parenting. After we'd finished talking about a lot of the things that you just heard, I wanted to ask her more about that. So we left the mics running while we had this conversation, and we've actually turned it into a second bonus episode that you can listen to right now if you subscribe to Mamamia via the link in our show notes.
It was such a surprise. I can't even begin to tell you how surprising that was. So, but she's just been the best, like the most amazing gift to our family.
Alex was in her 40s when she had her youngest daughter, who she named Toby. And I had a lot of questions about how it's worked out for her and the impact that it's had on her career and on her marriage and on her other kids. And she was very gracious and up for it in answering all my questions. So you can find a link to that episode in the show notes. You can read an extract of Alex's book on mamamia.com.au, and we'll pop a link to that as well in the show notes. Alex's book, Silver Linings, is available in any good bookstore. Our producer is Gia Moylan. The executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, and I'm Mia Friedman.